I think will speak for itself. Today I'm going to be dealing with a subject that's rather sensitive in the Ukrainian community, and one in which we probably ourselves did not half believe the charges we made 10 years ago when we first heard that there were countrymen of ours that were being accused of being Nazi collaborators, of being fascists, from the World War II period. At that time we suspected somehow that there might be some interplay between that and some of the things that the Soviet Union was attempting to do in order to split us up as an immigrant community. But I don't think that any of us were quite sure that we had any proof. We also weren't quite sure of the people that were being accused at that time. Some of these people were relatively unknown to us, certainly the case of Ivan Demjanjuk, who had been a very quiet auto worker in Cleveland, had really not participated much in the Ukrainian community in the first place, and so we weren't quite sure of who these people were. In the case of Bogdan Kuzhi, more was known about him, but again, we weren't quite sure one way or another. We didn't have eyewitnesses. The World War II situation was rather devastating. Many of the people that would have known who had done what had been killed. So to some extent, I think we were stunned at first. Simply stunned by the revelations that Ukrainians might have been involved in war crimes, had been fascist collaborators, Nazi collaborators, whatever you want to call them. I think we stopped being stunned and we started getting very hurt when we suddenly discovered that the Soviet Union was going to put forward evidence to prove that these people were in fact Nazi collaborators, fascist collaborators. We certainly knew that the regime, Soviet regime, which had done war crimes and crimes against humanity of its own, wouldn't be the best possible source for information for war criminals and criminals against humanity. So we began to make a very large stake. And it turns out that to some extent the community was somewhat successful initially, with all the motion that and commotion that it started, and all the protests in which it argued that we can't deal with KGB evidence or KGB supplied evidence. We didn't even call it Soviet supplied, we called it KGB supplied. It was rather, to some extent, rather effective. People themselves sat up both in the United States and in Canada eventually, where the processes took on a different light but along the same lines. And to some extent, the people who started the Nazi hunt within the Canadian government and the US government picked up and listened, began to listen. But very soon, the people who were running the Nazi hunts, both in the United States government and in the Canadian government, came back with a counteroffensive. The first position in this counteroffensive was that Soviet evidence was not invalid in and of itself. In and of itself, Soviet evidence was like all other evidence from any other country. You had to prove that this was, in fact, an active measure, a measure of disinformation against your community. You had to prove. You had to give names, dates, figures. You had to give a theme. You had to give a reason why the Soviets were doing this. That was the first argument. And the second argument, which came out of the left wing of those that were doing the Nazi hunt, was that this charge of Soviet intrigue in the Nazi hunt was in fact a lot of Cold War rhetoric, a Cold War hogwash. And to some extent, that counteroffensive by the Nazi hunters, in the case of the United States, the OSI, worked. Most Americans started believing, well, okay, the Ukrainians, yeah, you're paranoid about the Soviet situation, but on the other hand, don't you think that there are a couple of Nazis amongst you? Wouldn't you admit that? I mean, let's be real. Everybody had a couple of Nazis. You should have answered them at that point and stuff like that. Maybe there are a couple of Nazis in your family. But we didn't, because to some extent we were stunned by the counteroffensive they did. And we didn't really have proof. And then suddenly, man, like a whirlwind, the Demjanjuk case comes up. And suddenly, like the whirlwind, the Kалґарі case comes up. And suddenly we find ourselves, Demjanjuk is already being transported to Israel before he had actual trial, you know, before his trial made any sort of sense here in the United States. There were all sorts of weird setups, and Demjanjuk and Kалґарі essentially are railroaded in their cases. One ends up in Costa Rica before we have a chance to really create a serious defense, and one ends up in Israel under a death sentence, and what are we supposed to do with these people? And yet, in both cases, and I think that's how a group of us in New York, Ukrainians, got involved in this, and we came to the conclusions that we've now come and we're ready to give to the larger Ukrainian community. We started seeing problems within both the Demjanjuk case and the Kалґарі case. Within the Demjanjuk case, by now, you all know what those problems are. The ID card didn't quite fit into the picture and so on and so forth. There were so many mistakes on that ID card that it seemed like an obvious forgery. Demjanjuk was supposed to have been, or as Ivan the Terrible, was supposed to have been 3 places at the same time, Trieste, Sobibor, and Treblinka. When they talked about the height in describing him, he was everything from 5'7" to 6'3". I mean, in any court of law, any of this would have been grounds for reasonable doubt. And in the case of genocide, I mean, in a murder case, obviously reasonable doubt should sway in the direction of the defendant. It didn't in Demjanjuk's case. So we were a little bit suspicious what's going on there. In the second case, the Kалґарі case, it was obvious, man, when Vyacheslav Karavansky watched, one of our political activists, watched the videotapes of people being interrogated by the Soviet prosecutor and the American prosecutor for the Kалဃарі case, we obviously saw problems there as well. It seemed that the people who were testifying against Kалဃарі from Ukraine were in fact being prompted to give answers. There were some relatively ludicrous places in which the person says one thing and the translation to the American comes out differently. And the Americans never bothered to see that in fact the translation was the exact opposite of what in fact had been translated by the Soviet. There were ludicrous places, and we said to ourselves, there's something wrong with all these cases. And there's something wrong with the American approach, and there's something wrong with the Soviets handling this evidence. But we've got to find a way of proving, in reality, that the Soviets are a hell of a lot more involved, and that they actually aim to discredit the Ukrainian community in some way. So one thing, we had to show that there was a network that was working, and we had to show a theme. We had to give a reason why they were working to discredit us. It wasn't just enough to say, well, because we were all anti-communist, because that's, even in that particular case, that they could have used other tactics. Why did they use the Nazi hunt? They could have used the tactics about bourgeois nationalism, which they had used on earlier. Why fascism? Why Nazi collaboration? Well, we start this interesting story with the Demjanjuk case and the Kалဃarі case. And what we looked up, at first there was a bit of disappointment because we couldn't really pierce the veil of the kinds of information that was being given. In the case of Kалဃarі, we didn't get very much further. We couldn't get much further than the fact that the videotapes probably were doctored to some extent. The testimonies, that is. But in the Demjanjuk case, we had an enormous break at some point. I would say the break came when we found an article in Newsday. This was how breaks start, a simple break. A Newsday article by a woman called Marilyn Goldstein in New York that gives a rundown about the doubts about Ivan. And in that article, she gave an interesting 2 clues that became the basis for the following scenario. By the end, if you think that I'm absolutely nuts, we have people in Washington who now believe us and are ready to move on this. In fact, we have one of the people who's been listed here has already been arrested as a Soviet agent. We actually end up proving that the case against us was a classic, not just Soviet, but a classic KGB psychological operation, an active measure of the highest caliber. How? The first clue, and I literally mean the first clue Marilyn Goldstein provided us with, is she says that the detective that was working on the case in the 70s, for Demjanjuk in the late 70s, early 80s, suggested that there was a list that was put out that was first given to the Justice Department and then to the OSI, and this list contained 73 Ukrainians, and that this list was the list that contained Demjanjuk's name. Okay? And someone from a left-wing Ukrainian-American newspaper, left-wing, pro-Soviet American, Ukrainian-American newspaper, had handed in this list, and Demjanjuk's name was on it. That was the first clue. The second clue was that Alan Ryan, in an interview with her, claimed that there was some great Ukrainian patriot who had, in fact, done an entire write-up on Demjanjuk and sent it to OSI in 81. We didn't know who this was. We said pro-Soviet. It actually didn't even use the word pro-Soviet. It used left-wing Ukrainian-American newspaper. Well, I, as a Banderite, might have thought that Swoboda was a little left-wing, you know, Melnikites, Vikarites, and so on and so forth. But I said, no, but that's not left-wing. And they wouldn't betray a Ukrainian. Well, it turns out that I was right. I mean, it wasn't something in the community that we know. There was someone who had handed in a list, and Demjanjuk was on that list, and it was a list of 73 Ukrainians, and he handed it in 1977, and he was the one that started this process. But we couldn't find the source for who it was here in the United States. We had to go to a German press agency, and there, in a rather elaborate form, they come up with who was the person that turned in Demjanjuk. It turns out to be a character called Michael Hanushak. He happens to be the editor of something called the Ukrainian News. There's a Ukrainian version of it called Української. Now we said to ourselves, who is this guy? And we got the answer in the Ostdienst. The Ostdienst called it Moskau Frohlichten, a Moscow, pro-Moscow newspaper, a pro-Soviet newspaper. But I think with some sort of naivete, man, we weren't quite sure what pro-Soviet meant. And so therefore we went to search for this newspaper and this gentleman, Michael Hanushak. Luckily for us in New York City, it turns out that this pro-Soviet newspaper was published in New York City. That was an incentive for us. And it was a newspaper published on 85 4th Street. And this is an important address to remember, because when we started tracing Michael Hanushak and his background, and the background of his newspaper, what we suddenly discovered is that Michael Hanushak and the Ukrainian News have not only been pro-Soviet recently, they have been in the business since 1919, and the Ukrainian News in 1947 was closed down as a communist front. Okay, that was the first thing. The second thing is, well, we said, well, but that's McCarthyism. Being good liberal Democrats that we were, obviously not chauvinist. I'm hoping that this is taken on the camera. Hi. We decided we were going to give Michael Anushak and the Ukrainian News the benefit of the doubt. That might have been McCarthy, period. They may not really be communist any longer. Well, what we found is about Michael Anushak, this character who gave in the list to the Justice Department of 73 Ukrainians, amongst them John Demyanuk, Fedorenko, and Kuji, we now find. We find that that Michael Anushak, with his Ukrainian-American League, also located at 85 4th Street, which had been shut down as a communist front during the McCarthyite period, and we said, well, maybe they're not so bad. We find that he continues to have friends in the Soviet Union. First, in a rather long search, what we found is that the Ukrainian News corresponds with the Soviet Embassy in New York, the UN Embassy. It corresponds with the Soviet Embassy in Washington. It corresponds with the Soviet Consulate in San Francisco. It has friends up here amongst you in Canada, the Russian weekly The Vestnik, which is a pro-Soviet newspaper. It has correspondences with Українська книга in Toronto and Progress Books. It was in fact, or at least the way we saw it, it was in fact a classic Soviet front. But that wasn't enough. And the Americans or the Canadians wouldn't be impressed with the fact that this guy's got pro-Soviet connections. Well, so we've decided that we're going to look more deeply into the Ukrainian News and who Michael Anushak and the News were. And we discovered that at 85 4th Street, not only was there a Ukrainian-American League, but there was an affiliate of something called Tовариство Україна. If you've ever heard of Tовариство Україна, if you've been a tourist to Ukraine, you know who Tовариство Україна is. They are the propaganda sort of group that explains to you how lovely it is in Ukraine and why you should stop being fascist, bourgeois, nationalist collaborators and so on and so forth and love Радянська Україна. But Tовариство Україна, folks, is a lot more dangerous than simply a propaganda machine for the Soviet Union. And Tовариство Україна had very close to Sunki through telefaxes with our dear friend Michael Anushak, providing a lot of information, Tовариство Україна, from the Soviet Union to Michael Anushak through something called, the code name for it was Українська Panorama. Now it's interesting that information was being moved through Tовариство Україна from the Soviet Union. Michael Anushak had these connections to this day with Soviet fronts around the United States, but we still said this isn't impressive enough. So we started looking around for more evidence, and what we found is, in a classic fashion, a classic front would be one in which there weren't one or two or three organizations, but there were at least 15 organizations in one two-story building. And amongst the classic organizations, the ones that truly shocked us, because John Barron in his Inside the KGB calls it the classic American KGB front, was something called, at that very same address, something called the National Council for American-Soviet Friendship, headed by the Reverend, Presbyterian Reverend Alan Thompson. Now we began to get interested in all of this. We started seeing a larger picture in all of this. And we were interested in Alan Thompson in the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship. Well, we found that Barron already considered these characters to be in regular contact with KGB. Well, we found the same thing. They were in contact with two very important characters, one of whom is the information officer in Washington, Oleg Shupko, who also runs the connections back to Tовариство Україна. The National Council of American-Soviet Friendship was in contact with Shupko and Benyuk in Washington. Benyuk happens to be Major Oleg Benyuk. Two Olegs, Oleg Shupko, Oleg Benyuk. Now we said to ourselves, Michael Anushak, who handed in the list. Please remember, reflect. Who is Michael Hanushak? The one who handed in the Demjanjuk name is now involved with all these weird Soviet fronts. He himself is connected to Ukrainian, which is connected straight into the Soviet Union, and eventually when we found out that Ukrainian has further functions, we find that as we kept looking, everywhere we looked, we found another Soviet front. We looked at what Alan Thompson was doing at the time that we looked at it, and we found that Alan Thompson was connected with something called the World Peace Council. We look up in Levchenko's book, on the wrong side, and also in Barron's book again, and we find the World Peace Council is the leading peace organization created by the Soviet Union. The Peace Council exists in 135 different countries. It has a branch in the United States and a branch in Canada. Canadian Peace Council and the U.S. Peace Council. Now, everything in this situation told us, man, that there was some serious Soviet involvement somewhere. But how? Who? Where? We were interested not so much in the Soviet involvement, but how this had to do with the Nazi front. I mean, in the Nazi hunts. So what we started looking for is, at 85 4th Street, we started looking for material, or looking at the folksman to supply us with material, for the Nazi hunt. And what we found is, in 1985, 1986, something called the Nuremberg Commemorations Committee had been created, with some very strange characters involved, one of whom we will not have any further talk about because he is too large to handle at this point, a character called Simon Wiesenthal. But the others are well known to us. The Nuremberg Commemorations Committee was also an organization that had Michael Hanushak as part of it and Alan Thompson as part of it. It, in fact, was an interesting organization. It was attempting to buff up and reinforce the Nazi hunt in the United States, celebrating the 40th anniversary in the Nuremberg trials. We went to one of those things. We listened, we got their brochures, and what we found is the slogan was, "Smash the Nazis and the Cold Warriors." Now remember that theme, that it was smash the Nazis and the Cold Warriors. And what they were doing is celebrating and hoping to get more funds to prosecute the Nazis, the Eastern European anti-communist Nazis. But they were also saying that that continues, that there was a kind of rhythm to this whole process in which they say fascism continues to this day amongst the right-wing American Cold Warriors. Now, what we found at this Nuremberg Commemorations Committee is that it was located at 130 East 16th Street. It included Alan Thompson. It included Michael Hanushak. It included some very prominent figures in American politics. Bruce Wright. It included Morford. It included people that we were scared of handling. We thought, they can't be possibly communist. But what we found is that the Nuremberg Commemorations Committee was located at 130 16th Street, was itself, in fact, a classic Soviet front. Every organization in that building, whether it be the Committee for Friendship with the GDR, Committee for Friendship with the East Germans, who would want to be friends with the East Germans? Women for Racial and Economic Equality, Dr. Cecilia McCall, literally in her lettering with everybody, was literally in touch with every single Soviet front we could possibly think of in the United States. Plus, her literature was from North Korea, from Angola, from Ethiopia, you name it, she had it. But we said, well, but that's not necessarily, communist. Nobody will believe us. You can show them 100 times and they won't believe you, so you got to keep finding more material. Well, we found more material. We found the leading pro-communist Russian newspaper was also located at 13. We didn't even know this newspaper existed, but apparently it existed since the October Revolution 1917. It's called Ruskaya Golos. And apparently it too was looking for Nazi war criminals, but notice it wasn't looking for Russian Nazi war criminals. In the articles it was about Varvaryu and Demyuk and so on and so forth. So it was obviously looking for Ukrainian Nazi war criminals. We said to ourselves, all right, we found this thing on 4th Street, we found this thing on 16th Street, we found Soviet fronts, Michael Anushak is involved in all these Soviet fronts. Can we really prove anything with any of this? Well, Michael Anushak was idiotic enough in his Ukrainian news at some point to print an article about someone who was very important and who eventually leads us to the KGB itself. His name, and Romerstein, Herbert Romerstein, who's written a major book on it now, knows him very well, of him. His name is Charles R. Allen, Jr. Both the FBI and the CIA have had a hard time nailing him down. They think that they may have something against him. Folks, this is the most dangerous character we have to deal with because this character helped set up the OSI. He is also both an East German and Soviet agent. And we finally have been able to prove that. But when we started, how did we start? We listened to Michael Anushak's newspaper, and they had a review of his book, Nazi War Criminals in America, Facts and Action. And this was reviewed in the Ukrainian news, and it says, Charles Allen, who is, and in the blurb they said, leading authority. He's been quoted by the New York Times. He's been quoted by the Washington Post. He was an expert he gave expert testimony in the Congress in order to set up the Nazi hunting process. They give all these compliments to this Charlie Allen, and then they claim that Charlie Allen was the one that in '62 first started this process. In 1962, Charlie Allen first started the process in the Justice Department by handing in the first 16 names. It wasn't Mikey Anushak. Charlie had been there. And amongst those names, if you remember, was a famous upist called Lev Futala. It only turned out that Lev Futala had wounds from the Germans, so they had to let him go. It couldn't have been a Nazi collaborator with German shrapnel up his butt. But so we decided that we were going to look for Charlie Allen and see what he's all about, because at that time we did not know much about him. We didn't know anything about him except what they said. They said that he was a preeminent, that he worked for that he had written for the Washington Post. He had been quoted extensively by the New York Times during the Nazi hunt period. In effect, what he was doing a great deal of damage to us, but we didn't know who he was. So we started searching for Charlie Allen. And let's put it this way. Charlie Allen's background at first, what we started looking, it didn't take long to realize that he had some strange backgrounds. You read when they said he's a leading editor of something called the Presbyterian Churchman, Alan Thompson's little favorite church apparently, the Churchman. In the Churchman, what we found is a series of articles written from East Germany in which he says the only Nazis left are the ones in West Germany. The ones in East Germany have all been liquidated because the communists know how to liquidate Nazis, whereas the West, the decadent West, which is neo-fascist, does not know. This is written in 1977. It's written in letters to the Churchmen from East Germany, and we said, this is a rather strange character. But we also began to look up whether he is as known an authority as he is. And you want to know something? We found out, damn right, he's quoted by the New York Times. He's quoted by the Washington Post. He did start the process in 1962. He was the first one with the list. He gave it to Bobby Kennedy in those days. Do you have some for me? Because I'm thirsty as all. So who was Charlie Allen? The more we looked at Charlie Allen, the more we realized that Charlie Allen not only had strange views about East Germany, but he was in fact connected with the Committee for Friendship with East Germany. He had traveled to East Germany. He fell in love in East Germany. There's a romantic book that we found about Charlie Allen. It's called The Outraged Conscience. And it's the thing Seekers of Justice for Nazi War Criminals in America by Rochelle Seidel. Apparently she liked Charlie Allen, but the East German communist woman won his heart over. So she writes this book in tribute to him, I guess. Now this book, written for the left-wing circuit, not thinking then that the right wing or the center wing or even good left-wingers like me who've turned right because of reading this stuff might read this, she reveals a great deal about Charlie Allen. Who is Charlie Allen and what kind of damage did he do to us? First, Charlie Allen started his crusade against the Nazis in the United States as early as the 1950s. He got his first list from two characters called Morris Shapps and Chaim Schuler, both of whom worked for Jewish communist newspapers. It says so. Communist newspapers because everybody had communist newspapers. Every ethnic group did. The Ukrainians did with Hanushak. There was Anthony Bimba in the Lithuanian communist newspaper, Bimba, about the size of it, and Shapps and Schuler. One worked for the Morning Freiheit, a Yiddish newspaper, and the other worked for the Jewish Currents. And during the 50s, they were affiliated with the United States Communist Party, and Seidel says there's nothing wrong with that. We were all visionaries, utopians in those days. And Allen had been writing for The Nation at that time, a left-wing journal, but nothing that we could prove had commie connections and so on. But he got involved with Chaim Schuler and Shapps, and he took the list from them. But when he took the list from them, must have been something wrong because he must have taken something more from them because the FBI in 1957 and 1958 have got a file on him. In 1957 and 58 already, it seems as though Manny had made a connection with the communists. And the FBI had a file on him, and guess why in 1962 we did not have the Nazi hunt? Because in 1962, when Charlie Allen first submitted his list of 16, on which you find Carlos Linus, in that first list already, 30 years ago, Charlie Allen was turned down by Bobby Kennedy because Bobby Kennedy thought he was probably a communist. Can you imagine a liberal Democrat like Bobby Kennedy calling someone a communist? He must have been a goddamn communist. All right? But what's interesting is that the story goes further. He couldn't get through the lists in 1962. He couldn't give those lists in because people were accusing him of being communist because he was on the FBI wanted list. So what does he do in disenchantment with America, with the Kennedy period, which he thought was ended McCarthyism but did not? He goes to East Germany in desperation for 4 or 5 years. When he comes back, guess who was one of the founders of the Committee for Friendship with East Germany? None other than Charlie Allen. And Charlie Allen was so suspected when he did this, when he came back to create a friendship society with these Germans, that the CIA traced him for 10 years. His cables, his letters, his travels, anywhere he went. And Seidel says, isn't it awful that terrible CIA was tracing him? In fact, she says, and Charlie sued them in 1982 for infringement of his constitutional rights. In other words, the FBI for 2 years and the CIA for 10 years were tracing Charlie Allen, and yet somehow from 77 to 87, people like the Times and the Post, and then we find from the Anderson brothers, even Nightline had him on as a leading Nazi war criminal expert. Now, how did he get that expertise? It turns out that's where Charlie Allen's work in the OSI begins. In 1972, CIA was still looking after him, 72, 73, 74, still looking for him. In fact, the latest documentation is from 74. In 1974, the CIA itself is hit. You remember the Church Commission? There's all this revelation that the CIA was involved in assassinations and so on and so forth. Poor Trujillo and Lumumba and so on and so forth. The CIA was really bad news. Well, the CIA at that time has got a lot of problems. They let go of the work on old Charlie Allen. At the end of 1974, a character in the Immigration and Naturalization Service, a guy called John Weiss, phones him up and says, listen, Charlie, we want to talk to you. In the book, Chapter 7 of Seidel's Outraged Conscience, at first, she claims, at first Charlie Allen, when he got the phone call, thought that they were going to do, he even asked the question on the phone, he says, what are you going to do, deport me? They didn't want to deport him. Weiss was now interested in his list. Why? Because Eilberg and Holtzman had started a process against the Nazi war criminals, and they needed someone to give them something. And Charlie had one. Charlie had supplied them with a list back in '62. Nobody wanted to hear about it. So in 1974, Eilberg and Holtzman turn around, take Charlie's list, give it to INS, and say, Charlie, if you can come up with more Nazi war criminals, please do. Guess what? Charlie goes out there and finds the Nazi war criminal. He makes contact with Mikey Hanushak because the Commie Network now works in his behalf. He's got Mikey Hanushak bringing in lists. He's got Maurice Schatz bringing in lists. He's got Chaim Schuller bringing in lists. They're all the same lists. But they're coming from different sources. Look, there are sources from the Ukrainian community, sources from the Jewish community, and then Charlie Allen, that expert. He comes up with a list of 254 names. He hands it over to the INS at that time in '77. They're so stunned by his brilliant work that Liz Holtzman calls together a subcommittee on immigration and naturalization, and from that subcommittee she wants more testimony to prove that we need a Nazi hunting unit with teeth, more money, $2.5 million more dollars, and with 18 lawyers and 36 researchers. Something called the Office of Special Investigation. Never passed legislatively, created administratively. How? Because she creates this subcommittee in 1977, and guess who the expert witness on her board is? None other than Charles R. Allen, Jr. Read the book and weep. We said to ourselves, Jesus Christ. Charles Allen, a known agent. The FBI was after him in the 50s. The CIA for 10 years. Romerstein admitted to us, man, in Washington this last week that they've known Charlie Allen was bad news from 1951 when he left the Army in disgrace. He had been an Army intelligence officer. And this guy was the guy that was helping set up the OSI. Do you know, after his expert testimony, she got the $2.5 million in a rider to an amendment, and she administratively created the OSI. There has never been any legislation for OSI. It's been created administratively. But now it had teeth. 18 lawyers, 36 researchers. You can do some damage. How's a Diminuka or Kuji going to stand up against that? But Charlie Allen didn't just do his work in terms of the OSI. Charlie Allen, if you look carefully at his work, was a journalist. And he had a lot of journalist friends. In the book, Seidel says his journalist friends started doing good work. They started spreading the news. Once Charlie had been accredited as an expert in '77, a character called Ralph Blumenthal from the New York Times, Jay Bushinsky, who eventually starts writing into the Weekly to attack Kuropashi in the Weekly, what do you know, Jay Bushinsky and Charles Nicodemus of the Chicago Daily News, and most important, our man Howard Bloom and Herb Jaffe of the Newark Star-Ledger, who went after some of our people. They're connected to Charlie Allen. And she says so, and she says, boy, Charlie Allen was good. He spread the news to these people. We started looking whether they really did. Well, with Nicodemus and Bushinsky it was tough because the Chicago Daily News had been closed down, but the Star-Ledger was still around, the Times was still around, and we found that Blumenthal and Bloom did, in fact, take material from Charlie Allen. They not only took material from Charlie Allen, but Bloom had written a book called Wanted, The Search for the Nazis, and he quotes Charlie Allen extensively. The books you start seeing about the Nazi hunt throughout the United States, we picked up on those books, and we started looking every single one of those books. Guess what? They're quoting Charlie R. Allen Jr. The Anderson brothers, Inside the League, the thing that hits O Unupa ABN, that quotes Charlie Allen. Charles Hyam, or they said, I always called it Higham. They tell me it's Charles Hyam. What do I know? He writes a book called American Swastika. But when you read American Swastika, they're not just interested in anybody. In American Swastika, they go back to the 20s and 30s and call Svoboda in 1940, and Ivan Buchko, who later becomes Archbishop, while he's still hanging around in St. George, serving as a priest in late 30s, they called them Nazi collaborators. They claim that the Ukrainians were Nazi collaborators in the 30s. They call Svoboda, if some of you have seen that little article, they call Svoboda an official fascist newspaper for OUN in 1940. Now this is the kind of stuff that was coming out, but every time we looked, we found Charlie Allen's name appended to it. So we said to ourselves, who is this Charlie Allen? I mean, what is this Charlie Allen circle of friends? Where does it end? Maybe this line can lead us to the KGB operative that's behind all of this. Maybe we can finally prove that this is an actual KGB psychological operation. Because Charlie Allen is an agent of influence. The best you can do is say he might have worked for the Soviets, but you can't prove that he's KGB. So you got to find the KGBist. So we looked at Charlie Allen and his friends to see if we can't, at the end of the line, find a couple of KGB agents. At the same time, we started noticing something. As we were reading all this crap, as we were reading this, what we discovered is what were the people that were writing this stuff actually aiming at. And you want to know something? They weren't aiming at the general community. They weren't, and this is the sad part because he may hang and he's not really the point man in all of this. Demjanjuk wasn't the issue, folks. The real issue, if you read the Anderson brothers and you read Charles Hyam's book, read Howard Bloom's book, is this. And we were shocked by it. The real area where they're aiming are at the nationalists. OUN UPA. They kept pointing at OUN UPA UHVR ABN and the people that had been involved in the nationalist movement. And we kept reading this stuff and saying, how come Demjanjuk and Kouji men aren't mentioned? How come the camp guards? How come that stuff is not the stuff that they're really attacking if they're looking for Nazis? And the more we read it, we began to realize they weren't just attacking OUN UPA, which we know, man, in fact, we have documents now, I've just brought them out of Washington and so on and so forth, have documents the Germans claim, we have Galen's own documents that claim, that show that the Germans knew we fought against them. We have the ammunition now. But the fact is, the commies in 83 and 84 thought we were still ignorant. They didn't know that they had young, talented Ukrainians running around. And so they thought we'd never figure this out. But in fact, what it was is they were aiming to discredit OUN and UPA for a reason. The Ukrainian nationalists for a reason. I wish it were just only us, that we were so grand that they had to discredit OUN UPA. To some extent, that is true. But there's another thing that is involved in a classic Cold War psyop. It's not just a psyop, it's a Cold War psyop. What they attempted to do is this. They attempted to say Ukrainians generally were Nazis, but there were special Nazis. They were the real fascist killers. They were the OUN UPA. These OUN UPA, fascist collaborators that they were protected by the CIA in the 40s and 50s, and this is where we began to see the theme they're developing. In the 40s and 50s, the CIA brought the OUN UPA out here to do what? To train intelligence operatives in the CIA, to train the Green Beret. Trezub na zeleni beretci. So the argument was that OUN UPA came here flushed with Hitler's Ostpolitik, that is, Hitler's fascist attitudes towards the Eastern Europe and Russia against the Soviet Union, came here, convinced the CIA, convinced the American government, convinced the American army and so on and so forth that the Soviets were the bad news, and guess what? From that point on, the American government started moving along fascist lines. We must be enormously powerful to be able to do that. But this is what they were claiming, that the Eastern European fascists had convinced the CIA to start the Cold War, and so therefore the Cold War was concocted by these fascists who had fought as collaborators with the Nazis in World War II. Complicated? Not very. Because what they were trying to do, if you notice, is trying to say that the Cold War was nothing but a neo-Nazi concocted plot. That fighting against the communists was only done by people who had fascist tendencies. Not only in those days, but in our days. But we said, well, maybe this is bizarre. Maybe this isn't true. Well, guess what? We started looking further. And we found not only that it is true, that that was the theme, but we found the people that led us to the KGB agents. Because we started looking further. We started looking beyond the magic circle. We started looking at all the different things that we had found, and we found that everybody, ultimately, not only in the West, but back in this USSR, Товариство Ukraina was doing the same thing. The connection between OUN, UPA, and CIA operatives. They were even doing it to our activists. Our activists were being claimed to be operatives of the CIA, or operatives of the fascist OUN BA. Boomerang is a very good example of it, folks. Now, what we started looking for is stuff out here or stuff written there in those brochures through Товариство Ukraina to see if we can't come up with somebody, man, who really had KGB connections. Well, we found one here and we found one there. The two names that you're going to follow to the very end are a character called Philip Agee and Klim Mitruk. It turns out that when we started following the magic circle further, Charlie Allen further, his friends further, we ran into Joe Conason. And Joe Conason, remember the thesis, To Catch a Nazi? Levitt, Subject D, and he's holding it up like this, and they got a good photograph of him doing a salute. If you've ever seen that in the United States, from the United States, in the Village Voice, maybe I can show you a picture of it. It's such a lovely picture and stuff like that that I ought to show it to you folks. Here we have it. You've seen this. Yes? Has anybody ever seen this? And here it is. Imprisoned in 1934 for attempting to assassinate Interior Minister of Poland, Mykola Levitt ran the security force of the Ukrainian fascist organization, attending Gestapo training school where Jews were killed for practice, and had accused of the murder of many of his own countrymen. At the end, what does it say? Why has he been saved? At the end, in the little bracket here, it says, the CIA brought Mykola Levitt to the United States under an assumed name and concealed his past from the INS. Why? Because Mykola Levitt was working for the CIA. Now, what's interesting about this is they kept stressing this, and we looked, who is Conason? We found that Conason is involved with Charlie Allen. He's gotten this information from Michael Hanishak. We said to ourselves, what would Conason do for us? We looked from Conason to Loftus, the guy who wrote the Belarus file, and we started checking out if this was true about the other Eastern European groups, like the Belarusians. Lo and behold, Loftus, who wrote it about the Belarusians but had to mention us for 4 pages, and especially about OUN BA, and especially how the CIA helped them get into the United States, Loftus was involved in this circle too. When we started looking for all these names, we suddenly discovered that all of them write for an outfit, one outfit. And that outfit happens to be, we didn't know who ran that outfit, but that outfit happens to specialize in this crap. It's, you can see, special, the Nazis, the Vatican, and the CIA. In effect, this outfit, it's called Covert Action Information Bulletin, specializes in saying that anyone who is an anti-communist is a fascist. And that's why you needed those Eastern Europeans, because the connection, you needed the soulful connection. These Eastern European collaborators had now spread the Fourth International Reich and so on and so forth. The Fourth Reich. If you read it in the Inside the League, Anderson, Stichko, in running the ABN, was running the Fourth Reich, the Nazi International. This is the kind of stuff that was going on. But who ran this stuff? Did you ever ask yourself who ran this stuff? The guy who runs the Covert Action Information Bulletin is none other than a character called Philip Agee. Who is Philip Agee? He's the one that's turned in over 200 CIA operatives around the world. He is probably the leading favorite for the KGB, ex-CIA agent. He was once in the CIA. He decided to turn to the other side, and he's been turning over CIA agents to the Soviet Union. Well, he's now decided to get into the business of denouncing us. You should see some of the wonderful articles he's written in here. But what we found is that journal, every single one of the people that we found writing the stuff about us was in his journal. So we found Philip Agee on the one end. On the other end, we started looking at those brochures. And we looked at those brochures carefully. And some of those brochures were done by simple propagandists, folks. Buchko, Strukal, Babyak, but some of them were very interesting. They seemed to go one step further. They seemed to be pushing the OUN-UPA CIA connection. One of them, the key one, the one that started it all. He started in 1963 with his first brochures. Bezbachniky is a guy called Klim Dmitruk. Who is Klim Dmitruk? You wanted a KGB guy? You got him. Klim Dmitruk, according to the underground Samovidal, is none other than a character called Major Clementy Halsky. The guy specializes in this. He specializes in Soviet psychological operations against us. And now what was the thesis, man, behind this whole thing? Watch. Okay, for the ongoing conclusion of this, because we've gone through the entire process, for the ongoing conclusion, we already had two people that we knew had serious Soviet connections to the KGB. On the American side, Phil Agee. On the Soviet side, Colonel Clementy Halsky, KGB major. Now, what we had to do is come up with a theme that would make sense. We had the network, but we didn't quite have the theme straightened, why they would pick on us and the CIA and the Cold War and how, whatever you want. And so this is the way we had concluded that last part. And then we ended up with a third informator doing the confirmation of the third part. This is the way we concluded. While uncovering Halsky was a cause for some celebration, a live KGB link to the Magic Circle provided proof that a PSYOP was in fact in the works. The group soon regained its senses. An overarching question arose. What were Halsky, Agee, Allen, Hanushak and company up to with this CIA, Nazi, Reed, Ukrainian nationalist connection story? What were they up to? To find the ultimate objective of the Magic Circle, all these people that you had just met and should become your friends because you ought to know more about them, the group turned to an extensive reading of Dmitruk's works. And a crucial clue appeared in a piece written in 1974 entitled The Bastards, Bezbachniky. The work's major point was that the fascist UPA trained the first special forces. This is before Kennedy had the 10th Special Forces in 1961, predecessors of the Green Berets in the early 50s. Dmitruk's famous chapter was Trezub na zeleni beretchi. The clue set off a series of fireworks for us because thoughts first flashed back to Anderson, And in Anderson, Charlie Allen had been pushing that line. We had not first noticed that Charlie Allen had been pushing that all the counterinsurgency training in the 50s was done by killers, mechanics, Ukrainians mostly, for the CIA. It's wonderful when you read this stuff. You can't believe that UNUPA trained the entire Cold War apparatus. You know? We thought that they were just simple, humble folk, men that fought in the Carpathian Mountains. They suddenly had invented the Cold War. In the note, Allen had been quoted as saying the same thing. Once the quote clicked, thoughts flashed further back to Alan Thompson, the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship and the Nuremberg Commemoration Committee. The objective suddenly was clear as daylight. Smash the Nazis and their Cold War descendants. This was the major formula. The formula was simple. And now put Demjanjuk, Kouzy, and everyone else in context. A, the Soviets simply start by helping set up a Nazi hunt process. B, accuse Ukrainians generally as Nazis. That's the case of Kouzy and Demjanjuk, Varvaryu, and so on. C, eventually focus on the Ukrainian nationalists, the hardcore, as the real Nazis. D, show that the Ukrainian nationalists, read now Nazis, worked with a young CIA and trained the Green Berets during the 40s and 50s. And E, conclude with what they wanted to conclude in this classical psychological operation by the KGB, conclude by declaring that the Cold War, America's struggle to contain Soviet aggression, was nothing but a Nazi-concocted fantasy, a продолжение of Hitler's Ostpolitik of the 40s. And we said to ourselves, when we came to this conclusion, we said to ourselves, we've got to be out of our minds. Nobody's going to believe this. Well, we have a series of books, man, that we've come up with that do exactly that. And they're all connected in with Alan Thompson, Michael Hanushak, and they even quote Klim Dmitruk. Folks, this little book that you've got here by Doug Tuttle from Canada is one of yours. It's called Fraud, Fascism, Fraud, Famine, and Fascism. And it's called The Ukrainian Genocide Myth, from Hitler to Harvard. Wonderful piece of work and stuff like that. And if you look at its table of contents, it says, famine photographs. Which famine? Cold War I, the Black Deeds, a hoax. The Numbers Game. Cold War II, the 1980s campaign, Harvest of Deception. And then they say, this Harvest of Deception was created by the collaborationists and the collusionists, the war criminals and the anti-Semites in the genocide, the false famine genocide campaign. Now, who's Doug Tuttle? First, if you notice Doug Tuttle, and if anybody wants to, we have the Soviet Digest that talks about who are publishing companies. Doug Tuttle's book, first, he's got Charlie Allen in here that he quotes, Michael Hanushak that he quotes the Anderson brother, he quotes Connaughton, but йому ще на правду вдалося, he quotes two books of Klim Dmitruks. This guy is quoting KGB information. But he also, where did he publish it? You've got to understand that you've got yourself a Soviet publishing company here in Canada, and they publish this kind of crap. It's called Progress Books. And apparently it's in Bathurst, very close to 140. No, it's 71. Close, but not there. All right? Progress Books, 71 Bathurst Street, publishes this kind of stuff. But we said to ourselves, well, but Doug Tuttle's a dirty commie and stuff like that, you know, Progress Books. But the sad part is, we traveled around the world, only theoretically that is, and what we started finding is there are more books that are coming out. Blowback by Christopher Simpson. And the title is America's Recruitment of the Nazis and Its Effect on the Cold War. So we found it in Canada, we found it in the United States. We found, if you read this Strati Informator, we found it in Australia. Mark Ahrens, son of Laurie Ahrens, head of the Communist Party. Well, nobody knew that at the time until people started scratching and so on and so forth. Mark Ahrens was spreading the same thing about UNUPA, the CIA, and the Cold War, an extension of Hitler's Ostpolitik. We looked to England, the same thing. Ed Harriman in the New Statesman, cupboard full of Nazis, the same thesis. We looked to Sweden. There we fought them back. We fought them to a standstill. They had to they literally had to take a clearing statement, because we proved, in fact, that their information, they were using Connison, they were using Allen, and so on and so forth, was coming out of sources that were rather dubious. Alberta writes the same thing, a Swedish left-wing newspaper, and so on. In effect, what we found is that there's a network of people, that is doing this, and there's a reason for it. The reason is, and we very concretely know it because in America we suffered from it, the reason is they're trying to devastate us altogether in terms of our power. You know that 2 Ukrainians got fired from the Bush campaign. Both of them had nothing to do with the Nazis. Belinsky was someone who was born and raised in the United States, even though he's a super Uk and stuff. Fedorak was 7 years old during World War II, couldn't have possibly been a Nazi, but both got fired as Nazis. Well, guess what? Chris Simpson, Aaron, all these guys belong to the Magic Circle. They're all mentioned in this particular work by Russ Billant, Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Reagan administration. The role of the domestic fascist networks in the Republican Party and their effect on U.S. Cold War politics. It is this work that was published by the National Jewish Weekly that started the trouble for Fedorak and Belinsky and got them fired from the Bush campaign, and we now have no political impact in Washington. Not having political impact in Washington at this point is death for us here. In Amerikańskiej Imigracji, for Canadians, you've won in the Shane, God love you. But for us in the United States, we no longer have any political pull or any political power because our people, have been nailed as fascists, and think of why that would be important for the Soviets. Obviously, if things get hot in Ukraine, we don't have people who can represent us in Washington. Why? Because they've been besmirched as Nazis. Classic. The Soviets work in a classic way. The Soviets are slime balls. There is no word to tell you, how nasty these guys are and what kinds of methods they will use. They will use direct agents like Klim Mitruk, but they more often will use what are called witting or unwitting agents of influence. I would say that a witting agent of influence is Charlie Allen. Many of these other journalists may be unwitting agents of influence, but nonetheless, they have created a train of events for us that a nightmare, an Orwellian nightmare that we've been living now for 10 years. It's time for us to strike back. It's time for people to know that there are archives all over the place that prove quite the opposite about un UPA. And they all have these little red ribbons here which show that they're authentic. And they have Gehlen, General of German Intelligence, in 1944, describing how UPA was Germany's worst nightmare in Eastern Europe as a partisan group. Kupak had been destroyed. UPA was not. This is Gehlen, the same Gehlen that these bozos in blowback like Chris Simpson say recruited Bandera and Labid and so on and so forth. This is Gehlen talking about how nasty the Bandera Bewegung groups or the Bandera movement was against the Germans. We have those documents. It is time for us, one, to show to everybody that there is a network working against us, a deep network of disinformation, a classic network of disinformation. And we also have to do not only the defensive and show that the Bolsheviks are working against us, but we've got to be able to, and that's a responsibility for every one of you, start looking into the archives and finding this stuff. It's available. It's there. And you better get it before the Bolsheviks get it. Because if the Bolsheviks get it first and it disappears, we'll never be able to prove what in fact happened historically. So, where do I end? I end right here. This is it. This is the story. It's a nasty story. The commies are out to get you. The KGB is out to get you, and you better wake up. It's not just my paranoia. I've done 6 years of psychoanalysis because of this. All right? Yeah, definitely.
You said you arrested somebody already.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. I wish we've got the, I've got the article. Oh yeah. But I'm in such a mess that I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to find the article at this point and stuff like that. But it should be here. Yes, we have an article. Well, that's the interesting part. I think everybody was waiting for it, is, actually, why don't you look through this, and I'll take another question. Try to find the articles. There are 4 articles about Alan Thompson of the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship. I'm not sure how much of an impact we had, but Alan Thompson, 2 years ago, the FBI started searching after him. There was a name that we gave in one of the informators, because we always do this. We always give secondary sources. We give the letters and everything else. There's a name, Valentin Chebinsikov, that we gave from Moscow. Apparently, Alan Thompson was in very close contact with him. Apparently, Alan Thompson went to Moscow and picked up $17,000. They always knew that there were trails into the United States to fund the Soviet fronts, but they could never pick up on it. Well, the FBI started tracing through some of the names we had given, and apparently, as of February 1989, Alan Thompson was arrested. It's the first time in 25 years that they caught someone open-handedly and red-handedly taking money from the Soviets.
What's the title of this? Sorry.
It's Spy Ring, Spy Cat. You know where it is. So it's Spy Ring busted in Buffalo, and in fact, our Ukes men up in Buffalo were overjoyed with it. They thought it was the best thing that happened to them since Swiss cheese and stuff. Why am I always into Swiss cheese? Anyway, yes.
Yeah, Charlie Allen's money. Didn't he get some money from these Germans who arranged to have a book of his published called Heutzinger of the Fourth Reich?
He did,
the
in fact, yes.
step-by-step resurgence of the German General Staff.
But it's interesting, but do you know that he has...
Copy bestsellers behind the Iron Curtain?
You know, it's funny, Heutzinger and the Fourth Reich was based on a lot of material that was found. I mean, the last part, he doesn't quote it, but because he's scared. But there's a lot of material that was found at the bottom of that lake. Do you remember there was a thing
Czechoslovakia.
In Czechoslovakia? In 1964, suddenly they discover a series of boxes and stuff like that in steel boxes at the bottom of a Czechoslovakian lake that prove that half of the German general staff already in the post-war period under NATO had been Nazi collaborators, German officers, high-level members of the German staff, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that under those conditions, NATO nearly fell apart in 64, 65 because they were looking for all these Nazis. It turns out that Władysław Bittman, a Czech espist, comes out in 1968 and reveals to the world, and Allen used that material, knowing that that material probably was falsified. In 68, Bittman comes out and says, "Oh, you mean those boxes they found at the bottom of the Czech lake? Me and my diver friends from the SB, Czech SB, put it there to discredit the Germans." Now, what happened is, while that discredited the campaign against the German generals, nobody ever decided to discredit Charlie Allen for writing that book, Heutzinger and the Fourth Reich. I don't know who he did or what he did, who he knew, and whatever. Maybe it's in here, Mark. It's not in there. Okay. Because I know we were looking at it yesterday. It must be the KGB again. Yeah. Anyway, yes, that's...
Follow-up question. Wasn't Allen also, for a time, briefly employed by the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith?
Yes, he was.
And wasn't he also employed in some capacity with the New York Electrical Workers Union and Communist Front?
In 1959, yes, he was.
Communist-dominated organization?
Not only that, but I've got news for you. This is Simon Wiesenthal. Now, this is between us. We're all Ukrainians. And I'm not going to pick on Simon Wiesenthal, because there are a lot of Judea men that have actually started trying to help us because they realize that the Zionists are being hit. But Wiesenthal happens to be a nasty. Because it turns out this. In this book, I read it very carefully. Like Blumenthal, Herb Jaffe, investigative reporter for the Star-Ledger in Newark, New Jersey, was introduced to the subject of the Nazi war criminals during a meeting with Wiesenthal. Jaffe discussed his stories with me, that's Rochelle Seidel, who's writing it, in a March 22nd, 1983 telephone interview. Jaffe said that the Nazi hunter told him in 1977, "You got some people here in Jersey." And that was the Ukrainians they were looking for. It says right here, "He sort of inspired me," Jaffe said, That's how I got to know Chuck Allen. Wiesenthal suggested that I call him. Wiesenthal suggested that Herb Jaffe call Chuck Allen, Charles Allen. We're beginning that investigation, and folks, what we found about Wiesenthal is not pretty. This is out of classified documents that have been declassified in 1985. The Nishnek group has gotten some of this stuff. This declassified interrogation of Wiesenthal suggests that he wasn't in the concentration camp all the time. It, in fact, in this thing done by United States Army intelligence, Wiesenthal to Kirk Ponger on 28th May 1948 at 11:30 to 12 o'clock. Nice time. What experiences did you have with the Wehrmacht? We perhaps should put this question more concretely. From when were you a partisan? Wiesenthal was not in concentration camps throughout the whole war. He escaped, supposedly. We have a whole stack of things. In 1943, ran away to the partisans, and then was recaptured in 1944 and did a tour of German concentration camps. Can you imagine an escaped Jewish laborer from a concentration camp and then a Soviet partisan, and the Germans don't shoot him on the spot? They give him a tour of 7 different concentration camps? A little strange for me, wouldn't you say? But what I find more strange is when he testifies about where he fought with the partisans, and that they were in fact Soviet partisans. He says, where was that? Between Lemberg and Ternopil. We always knew what the Germans had, when the Germans had signaled. Very often it was so that a group of policemen, auxiliary police, were at the edge of the woods. 50 men would take a walk some 100 meters deep into the woods, fired a few rounds, and then it was reported to us some 100 partisans shot dead and 10 partisan shelters uncovered. There were also partisan groups who were friendly to the Germans. They were the so-called UPA group. This group was supported by the German army to fight other partisans. Their attitudes were anti-Soviet, and they received their equipment from the Germans, which is completely against what Galen says about us. But the next line is the crucial line. We did most of our fighting against this group. Wiesenthal was not only in the Soviet partisans. Thanks. I have 15 minutes to explain this. I don't want 15 minutes to explain this. I need 1 minute to explain this. He was in the Soviet partisans. He achieved the rank of officer in the Soviet partisans, which usually means, man, that he had to be somehow connected with the party, perhaps even in intelligence and KVD capacity and so on. This SOB, and I will say this on camera, this SOB fought against our partisans. He says it. It's his own words in 1948. He excludes that fact of being in the Partizanka in Murderers Amongst Us, the book that he writes in '67. We've got real problems here, folks. Because we're not going to hit on Jewish groups. But we certainly, because the Jewish groups, man, you know, they have their own problems. Now the Zionists are being accused of being, fascists too. But guys like Wiesenthal and guys like Reuben Eisenstein, who wrote their Soviet partisan memoirs and call it Jewish resistance in Eastern Europe, you wouldn't believe the kind of hideous racist stuff they've written in their book. The innate love of looting by the Ukrainian savage peasantry. Innate love? What was it? We genetically have a love of looting? What are you guys, sick? That's racist. That's chauvinist. And we ought to explain it to them. We don't want to deal with your racism and chauvinism. To some extent, Wiesenthal has already discredited himself. If you read the Shane Commission carefully, when he made that stupid remark about the 6,000 Nazis sitting in Canada, that basically discredited him, at least here in Canada. He is not discredited in the rest of the world, and he's still doing us some damage. But someday, if we can find some info on him and his relationship to Charlie Allen, so we can get back to Charlie Allen, we're going to go after Wiesenthal also. Quietly. Not as a Jew, but as a Soviet agent, which is what he was.
Question. Wasn't Charlie Allen unmasked on New York television in 1962 on the David Kupcinet show?
Yes. In fact, I guess you must have read the book, because yes, it turns out, yes. And in fact, let me read how cute this was. He goes, memorize the book, so here it goes. And there's Rabbi Yumpel and stuff like that, who's the founder of the National Committee against, we're on camera, National Committee Against Nazism on the trip to Eastern Europe. This character here was a devastating character. Yumpel's record, I mean, he did an enormous amount of damage for us in the 60s and 70s because he had very high-level friends in some of the major Jewish organizations. The problem is, at least until 1980, Yumpel and Allen couldn't get anywhere with their information because most of the Jewish organizations, let's be fair with them, most of the Jewish organizations didn't want to go along with this. But once Yumpel was able to make a break with Bronfman in the World Jewish Congress, and they were willing to start doing those lists forward and so on and so forth, then all of this, man, we started getting nailed in America, and you started getting nailed in Canada. But it was Yumpel and Allen that created this committee, to put it in context, and in effect, they're both invited, but only Allen appears on the thing. Let me read the whole paragraph. While in Chicago with Rabbi Yumpel for a 63 rally, Allen appeared on The Cup Show, a syndicated 4-hour television talk show hosted by Irving Kopechnik, syndicated Chicago Sun-Times columnist. Other guests were Hugh Hefner, I guess to talk about Playboy, Dick Gregory, the cartoonist Jules Pfeiffer, and Larry Moyer. Remember that while in the midst of all this Nazi war criminal, this is Seidel writing it, writing what Allen is saying. Larry's film, The Moving Finger, had just come out, and my Heusinger book was just out. And Moyer and I were also writing for such publications as Playboy, Allen says. Kopechnik revealed on that program that he had talked with the then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who told them that I, meaning Charlie Allen, was motivated and probably a communist agent. All of my efforts on the Nazi war criminal issue and those of our Committee Against Nazism, Yumpel's committee, were from the first investigated and systematically thwarted by the FBI and Kennedy. Charlie kept claiming in the 60s that the liberal Democrat Kennedy was stopping him from putting up this Nazi thing. The reason why this liberal Democrat Kennedy stopped Charlie Allen was not because he was a McCarthyite, though some people say that in the 50s he was. The fact is that the liberal Democrat Kennedy stopped this guy because he had it in the files that Charlie Allen was in fact involved in some of the reddest cases of the 50s, including his journalistic work for the Big Red One, the communist-infiltrated electricals union in 1959. You're absolutely right. And so, this is the story, folks. All these characters, man, have been doing some serious damage for us. And we do the typical, what we've got to get out of is the typical, ті зробили, чи ті зробили. Forget the ethnic groups, man. Чи жиди зробили, чи москалі зробили, so on and so forth. Правда є, що вони там нам шкоду зробили. But remember, москалі, їх індивідуальний об'єктив є розбити нашу громаду і навіть розбити якийсь-небудь альянс між нами, а навіть євреями, що тут живуть. So in effect, the enemy number one for us, and if you find anybody in the community that starts doing it other way, you start smelling them out, enemy number one for us is the Muscovites, man, sitting in the Kremlin. Those Bolsheviks have done this psyop. Everyone else, the Jewish groups, the Ukrainian commie groups, the East Germans, whatever you find, they're all pawns in the game run by the 2nd and 5th Directorate of the KGB. Your enemy is not the other groups. Your enemy is the KGB. And remember, Andropov's greatest protege, Andropov for 20 years was the head of the KGB. His greatest protege was Gorbachev. We may be in for more hot times than you could possibly ever imagine. Now, do we have that?
Yeah. Why did they call him Alan Thompson, not Charlie Alan?
This is Alan Thompson, the guy who heads the National Council of American Soviet Friendship. This is not Charlie Allen. Charlie Allen is one, and Alan Thompson is the guy at 85 4th Street, the National Council of American Soviet Friendship. Two double agents here help seize a spy suspect. Alan Thompson is charged with violating U.S. Customs law by depositing $17,000 he received from Moscow in a Buffalo bank branch under the name of another person. This is how they bust him. It's like Al Capone. You can't bust him for being a commie spy. You have to bust him for his money. Thompson is the executive director of the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship, according to Buffalo FBI Chief Robert Langford. Вже один з тих ідіотів in our chain. One of the idiots in the chain and stuff like that has gotten busted in the last 3 months. Hopefully, maybe we can get rid of some of these other schwan. Charlie would be one hell of a guy to get rid of because he had a lot of friends. Alan has done us more damage than any single person. He was even friends with Tuttle out here in Canada. He was friends with Aarons in Australia. He was friends with Ed Harriman, New Statesman in England that did cupboard furtive a thing. We even have his address and telephone number. What do you think we should... No, not on camera. Not on camera.
What's his birthday?
What's his birthday? Well, actually, if you want to read about his birthday, he's right here. It has about him being a great high school football player, his first love, and stuff like that. It's a wonderful book. If you got to read something heartwarming and stuff like that, it's this. All right. That's about, any other... Yeah, get some more questions, because this is important, and we'll finish it up. Proszę.
Now, under Gorbachev, there is major change. Even I received some articles from the Ukrainian local newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So there was I don't know if it is like play or what. Now they celebrating in Ukraine 100 years Ukrainian immigration to Canada. 3 years ago there was shame on them, they're all Nazi, they were so what does that mean, everything? They need not our money traveling or short of dollars, or this is just double play to hit us in the future more hard than it's now?
There's a guy, it came to me from Toronto. There's a guy that wrote from Toronto. He teaches in the Toronto school system. Roman, you've got to help me on this one. Chow gave it to me and stuff like that. There's an article that was written by some bozo who claims that he has Dmitro Turovech. That is one of the slickest things I've ever seen. This is the new Gorbachev deal. This character doesn't really praise the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, but what he does is he says they made some mistakes, the Ukrainian commies up here, but they were part of the immigration and so on and so forth. He integrates them very nicely, and about the only thing he does in that work, and this is to celebrate, this is the kind of stuff you're going to get for the 100 years celebration if you don't watch it. We're part of our immigration. They've already now integrated the Yuki commies into our immigration, one, and in that work, he mercilessly goes after the nationalists. And what he tries to sell you is something very, very important. I told you the fourth point in the fifth informator. I can read it now. There's a very important thing that happened to the Estonians. This is the fourth point, and that's why Możemir дуже добре підкреслив. Because the young Ukrainian Canadians got to understand, watch when someone starts telling you that Canada is the only thing in your life. And that you've got to remember we've been here 100 years and you're an integral part of Canada, and forget about Ukraine. Because the fourth point, I told you there were 4 points. I'll go over the 4 points again. The way Soviet active measures work against the Estonians, and they work against the Ukrainians, is the Soviet Union and the immigrant communities, a case study in active measures and disinformation. The 4 points are, first, discreditation of the immigrant communities and their political leaders in the eyes of the host society. They did that with the Nazis. The second is the sowing of general discontent in the immigrant communities in order to weaken their political effectiveness, breaking up organizations. They did that in the United States. UAK, RADA, UKK. The third is driving a wedge between community leaders and the mass of their members. Що ті провідні люди знають. The fourth is the one that this 100 years in Canadian love that you might engage in the next 3 years might be all about. Active cultivation of contacts with those elements of the communities that are not strongly anti-communist, anti-Soviet, primarily youth born and reared in the West. You folks are the target. They want to control your horizontal, they want to control your vertical, they want to be your outer limits. You can't allow for that. And that's why this is very important. I mean, there's a great deal of information, there's a great deal of of things and everything. You're absolutely right. Мирон, я щасливий, що ти то підкреслив. Навіть такі малі речі, вже як будуть виходити такі речі, як той Чилей Варіат в Торонті написав, where he integrates the Yuki-Kamis into it, and he goes after the nationalists with a baseball bat, and then he says, forget the nationalists, forget the Yuki-Kamis, what you ought to be is the center, good Ukrainian Canadians who love Canada more than you love Yuki-land. Because this is truly your homeland, forget Ukraina. Gorby would love you to forget Ukraina. His little disinformation artist would love you to forget Ukraina. Proszę.
They're not only looking for ideological influence for us, they're looking also for the properties, Ukrainian people. As you know, Trudeau a couple of years, many years ago, signed some secret document with the Russians. When the Russians lawyers know, they can, along with people who don't sign any will,
Very good.
their property, they belong still to the Russian property.
You know, Miron, you ought to get up here and give us a little speech because you're absolutely right. Sheldnarish. And this is very important in our community, and we ought to approach our old folks. This is another thing that the younger element. You can have a lot of money. Our old folks were very industrious. And it's not only happening в Канаді, то тоді ще так само в Америці. They not only take money, але той Шубко, because he's an information and science officer, він був в Філадельфії, до наших адвокатів звертався з патентами. Українці, що не тільки залишили гроші, як померли, але патенти, Совєтський Союз знаходить якогось третього стрічного брата і каже, то не належить до вас в Америці, то належить до родини в Україні. And they ship hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of our dollars back into the USSR for the relatives. Since there is no private property, how can it be for our relatives in the Soviet Union?
They've already done that in Winnipeg. One guy who died passed away.
Well, it's happening everywhere. Our wealth is being passed over there because a lot of our old folks don't write out wills. It's as if we didn't have enough lawyers. Every third Yuki man in New York is a goddamn lawyer, including my friends like Asha and stuff.
If we know something, for example, lonely people who don't know what to do with elderly people, what to do with these properties, so not let influence them to give this property or make a will for the church, for anything.
Absolutely, for foundation.
But not for full or artificial relatives from the Ukraine.
Right.
Because now it's like wave, immigrants, guests, and everywhere.
Yes.
Everybody knows to somebody come and get. And I found out there is some people who very far away, who very barely speak Ukrainian even, they pretend they are relatives, they come in there and they asking write the will.
Yes.
Write the will because you lonely, so give us. So Russia taking 70% those properties, and this is just plenty of money.
Just remember, man, that they don't get this stuff in the Soviet Union because there isn't private property, you know, in the Soviet Union.
And another thing, they're also making like under cover all our heritage 100 year here. They taking, I saw the guy who was in Saskatoon making lists, like heritage list. Oh, you have somebody, where is your relatives? When they come,
Oh,
which
that's very
generation?
interesting.
And he called people, sign the form. Oh, we have, maybe you have
Oh,
some
you guys in
relatives
Canada,
Ukraine.
man, really
Then,
hot stuff.
you know what? I asked him, from where you get those forms and this? Oh, I'm doing for myself. But where? Who influenced you to do this? And he, like, opened the letter. There was a letter from Russian embassy. And another letter was from, just directly from towards Ukraine. So
I got
they
you.
already doing.
I got you, man.
It's a thing,
It was
a group
incessant.
formed in Calgary that what they want to do is they want to trace your roots back to Ukraine.
Yes, this is another guy who saw this guy.
Remember, folks, man, the stuff that's come out, I want another warning. Don't kid yourself. They may have quieted it down for a couple of years, but the stuff that's come out, we are coming out with material, but our stuff comes out more slowly than their stuff does. If they ever come back to the Nazi hunt, if you start explaining who knew who in Ukraine and they've got a biography on you, in 2-3 years, watch how your uncles and your mothers and grandmothers are going to be called Nazi war criminals. I want to tell you something. This is the most dangerous book that came out of this thing. potentially, even though they've quieted down. Because in blowback, they actually say the labor battalions, ті, що поїхали на працю до Німеччини, вони кажуть, they doubled as goon squads and triggermen in the Holocaust. Ви знаєте, кілька наших людей вислали на змушену працю до Німеччини? Вони тепер кажуть, що люди, що так само працювали as goon squads and triggermen in the Holocaust. You watch. Кожний українець старший, що тут будуть їх вивозити if you don't watch your butt about what you do with these guys. These guys are good. And you can smirk, and you can think, and you can do anything you want to, but remember, they're out there, and they're not smirking. All right, I think, yeah.
Okay, with all this information, how much does the American government know? Or have they done anything?
I delivered the same thing that I've just given you. I delivered in the Rayburn building in Washington and stuff. And Romerstein, man, who's written the book KGB versus the Main Enemy, with Levchenko, quotes some of this stuff already. I mean, he's ready to go. He and Stan Levchenko, who was the KGB major who defected from Tokyo a couple of years back and gave more information about active measures than anybody alive did. This character and stuff like that, and Romerstein have now written a book about these active measures, including the active measures against the immigrant community. I'm citing some of his stuff here.
So are there imminent arrests coming? Or?
Well, at least one of these bozos and stuff like that got nailed, yeah. This guy was a major factor. Folks, this is the guy, they might have Kanadi. I was going to go through the whole shitka that you've got Kanadi and stuff like this, well, the one of Amadici. But to make it a long story short, because I think I've got about 1 minute, this guy is the guy that invented the Twin Sister Cities project. The twin, the Sister Cities project. This guy invented it for the United States. Now it's in Canada, folks. You got View, Winnipeg, Gorby Love, and we all exchange, and we talk to Soviet citizens there, and they talk to us. And boy, well, don't we have fun. Well, this is the guy who invented the Sister Cities project in the United States, man. Baltimore, Odessa, They keep picking on Ukrainian cities. Chicago, Kyiv, and stuff like that,
You want to talk for a moment about the revolving door
Take as long as you want.
that exists?
We're not supposed to say that.
The revolving door that exists between the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, the headquarters of the World Jewish Congress in New York, and the OSI in Washington. Perhaps you might take Eli Rosenbaum as an example, or any other lawyer that seems to find employment quite readily in any one of these three organizations, and sort of as a stepping stone go from one to the other with breathtaking ease.
We have Alan Ryan, not just the Simon Wiesenthal thing, but we have Alan Ryan's piece here in which he writes to Rudenko as of 1980. Does anybody know who Roman Rudenko is? Roman Rudenko, the Procurator General, he's now dead, is a real nasty. In 1953, if you read Edward Buka's book on the revolts in Verkuta, in Kingir, and Kolyma, Roman Rudenko, the Procurator General who started the process with Alan Ryan, and Alan Ryan and Rudenko were in love with each other, writing all these cute little letters to each other. That Rudenko was a war criminal. He shot 63 unarmed Ukrainian UPA OUN members after the revolt was crushed and stuff like that. They were unarmed. They were now political prisoners and stuff like that. He shot them in cold blood. Edward Buka, a Polish AK person and stuff like that, testifies to that in his book. And this is the same Rudenko, war criminal, that was in 1980 helping pass this information on. We also have noticed, and Markom, you're going to have to find, you both goddamn son of a bitch, I've lost half the goddamn material and stuff like that. You've got to find, we have World Jewish Congress stationery. Nishnak and apparently some of our people, man, have all sorts of weird connections. It's gotten so ridiculous with Eli Rosenbaum that Eli Rosenbaum has lists and files on all our people. Old Mikey Buchurkiw of the Weekly. Sort of mamby-pamby, milquetoast, Melnikite, man, who is scared of his own shadow. Eli Rosenbaum, and I can say this on camera, can't I? Eli Rosenbaum has a 2-page file on his anti-OSI, anti-Nazi activity and says, I've got more stuff on what Zaryckyj has written in the weekly. This is something that he is sending to the OSI. Now, I mean, open door, it feels like OSI, man, is a field office for the center in Los Angeles. And they've got files on our people. There's got to be something wrong with this. Because it's true that maybe private organizations can keep files on citizens, and I'm not sure how constitutional that is, but when Eli Rosenbaum gives it to OSI, I hate to say it, but OSI is a governmental organization. What's it doing with files on our citizens? And we've got the documentation to prove that they're doing this. And there's something wrong here. And that open door policy, thanks. You're good, Mark. You should get into archival work.
I thought Zaryckyj was Canadian. What's it doing in the States?
Oh, that's good. Well, would you like to read it? Because Zaryckyj,
They're going through
Zaryckyj,
the
man,
CMP.
yeah, they're going through our CMP material also. You've got to remember, man, that this was the World Jewish Congress, and the World Jewish Congress has connections in just about every city. I mean, in every country. So there is that problem. Yeah, there is that problem. But what we've got to do is we've got to call them out on this stuff. There's something illegal with this stuff. Show me.
I have small 2 questions. Those cultural exchange, now in Edmonton they're planning big party on Ukraine and etc.
That'll be my afternoon lecture.
And another question, very small. Why are we not going after those Russians who was killing Ukrainian innocent people in Poland, in Ukraine?
Oh, you mean like Katyn Forest, man, with the Polakia and stuff like that? And Bukvina?
Yeah.
The 300,000 men, що через чашку дістали кулю?
Yes, Ukrainian can find in Ukraine.
Because our academics who go into the Soviet Union, who might be able to do some work, don't do that work. That's the problem. Don't do that work, because when they come there, remember, if you're from Eastern European studies as an academic, as a scholar, and you have to go into the Soviet Union to get your primary sources, and that's why I'm glad I don't teach Eastern European studies. I do political theory, Plato and Aristotle. They can't get me, that's not my field. I don't have to go to the Eastern Europe to get sources to stay in the university. Anybody who teaches in the Eastern European fields, in Slavic fields, to go there to do an investigation, they have to answer to the Soviet government. And that's why some of our stuff is so poor. There's only one character, there's only one professor who actually does good work, one institute that does good work anywhere in the world for Ukrainians, and that happens to be the guy that the Banderites always call that ex-Trotskyite and stuff like that, Kravchenko. Kravchenko happens to run one hell of a good institution up in Alberta. If you're from Edmonton, you should really be proud that the guy does that, because he's really put out a lot of good stuff. The rest of these academics, who ought to be, some of whom ought to be, all right, some do literature and culture, but some ought to be doing the history, they can't do it. Instead, what we find in the World Jewish Congress files and stuff like that, and in the OSI files, because there was a listovanya between the two that Nishnek picked up on from his files in government, when they got it through Freedom of Information, they found out, man, that people like Mogochi 10 years ago was asked by OSI when it first was established to go through the Harvard archives before he left for Toronto and his teaching job in Toronto, to go through the Harvard archives to look up stuff on O'un Upa. That's Mogochi's job. And when you see this and when you read this, it makes you want to be sick. And should I be talking about it openly? Are there people that are going, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't be talking about this openly? Well, I want to be talking about it openly, because the one thing that that's going to lose the entire community is if nobody talks about it. And it's happening. And we ought to do something about it. It's bad, folks. We're in a war. And the Soviets are not going to use hot wars anymore if they're going to continue to expand. They're going to use the greatest warfare methods, men, of the 20th century. The ones that go into the 21st century, except that they go back to the old Chinese general method. You defeat the enemy before they ever get into the battlefield. It's called political warfare, psychological warfare. They've already disarmed you before you got to the battlefield. And if you smirk about it, that's when you're going to get nailed.